What happens when the storm you are running from is not the one raging in the skies, but the one brewing inside a man's heart? On a night when the world seemed to be coming apart at the seams, a night in the deep rural heartland of 1950s America, the heavens had opened up and unleashed a fury that turned fields into lakes and roads into rivers of mud. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, tearing at the shingles of an old farmhouse, a lone sentinel against the chaos. Inside this house, or rather, inside its barn, a man moved with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who had long ago run out of things to rush for. His name was Arthur Blackwood, and the landscape of his face, etched with the deep lines of 60-some years of hard labor and quiet sorrow, told a story of its own. It was a story of loss, of solitude, of a heart that had been boarded up as securely as the windows on his house against the storm. The lantern he carried in his gnarled, earth-stained hand was a tiny sun in the vast, dark world of the barn. It threw long, dancing shadows that turned familiar shapes, a pitchfork, a stack of hay bales, a rusted tractor part, into monstrous figures from a forgotten nightmare. He was securing his livestock, the only living companions he had left in this world. The low, nervous shifting of the cattle and the soft bleating of a few sheep were the only responses to the cannonade of thunder that shook the very foundations of the building. He was a man performing a ritual, a set of motions he had repeated for decades, a physical prayer against the wildness of the world. But on this night, the ritual was about to be broken. Beneath the roar of the wind and the percussive drumming of the rain on the tin roof, he heard something else. It was a sound so small, so impossibly fragile, it was almost swallowed by the tempest. A whimper, a sound like a bird with a broken wing. For a moment, Arthur dismissed it. The wind plays tricks. An old barn groans and settles. His mind, he thought, was perhaps as weathered and unreliable as the timbers above his head. Yet he heard it again, a sliver of sound that cut through the noise, a note of pure, human despair. It seemed to come from the darkest corner of the barn, from a large mound of hay meant for winter feed. He moved toward it, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth floor. The lantern light pushed back the shadows, revealing the texture of the straw, the dust motes dancing in the golden glow. He held the lantern high, his breath catching in his chest. A feeling he hadn't experienced in years stirring within him, a mix of curiosity and a deep, instinctual dread. What new trouble had this storm washed up onto his shores? He reached the hay pile and hesitated. Every instinct he had, honed over a lifetime of solitude, screamed at him to turn back, to ignore the sound, to retreat to the quiet emptiness of his house and let the world solve its own problems. He had done his time. He had paid his dues to fate and had been given nothing but silence in return. But the sound came again, closer this time, a choked sob that was undeniably real. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his years, he set the lantern down on a nearby crate and began to push aside the heavy, damp hay with his bare hands. The straw was cold and smelled of rain and earth, and then his fingers brushed against something soft, fabric. He pulled back another armful of hay, and the lantern light spilled into the hollowed-out space within. There, curled into a space no bigger than a coffin, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 19, a ghost of a person illuminated in the flickering light. Her face was as pale as milk, stark against the dark bruises that marred her cheek and temple. Her dress, a simple cotton print, was torn at the shoulder and caked with mud, telling a story of a desperate flight through the storm. But it was her eyes that seized him, that held him captive. They were wide, not with the simple fear of being discovered, but with a terror so profound, so bottomless, it seemed to have extinguished any other emotion. And as those eyes fixed on him, on this old, weathered farmer standing over her, they did not see a rescuer. They saw another man, another shadow, another potential threat in a world that had clearly shown her nothing but threats. In that single, suspended moment, the roaring of the storm outside seemed to fade into a dull hum. The universe shrank to the space of that barn, to the space between an old man who had lost everything and a young girl who looked as if she was about to. This was Ilara, though he did not know her name yet. She was a fugitive, a secret hidden in his hay, a soul hiding from a storm far more violent and far more personal than the one trying to tear his farm apart. For Arthur Blackwood, a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades building a fortress around his own heart, this was more than an intrusion. It was a siege. He was being confronted with a choice, a terrible and immediate choice that threatened to shatter the fragile peace of his solitude and force him to look into a darkness he thought he had buried long ago with his wife. His first thought was practical, cold. He should send her away. He was an old man. Whatever trouble she was in, it was not his to bear. The town, the sheriff, they could handle it. His life was a quiet, predictable cycle of sunrises and sunsets, of planting and harvesting. It was a small kingdom of one, and he was its tired, solitary king. To let her stay was to invite chaos, to invite the world he had so deliberately shut out right back over his threshold. The risk was a fire he had no desire to feel again. He had already been burned down to the foundations once, and he knew he did not have the strength to rebuild a second time. The walls he had built were there for a reason. They were there to keep the pain out. But then he looked at her again. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way she tried to make herself smaller, to disappear into the straw. He saw past the terror and glimpsed the child beneath it. He saw the ghost of a daughter he and Eleanor had always dreamed of, a dream that had turned to dust with her last breath. His hardened resolve began to crack, just a little. The silence he had cultivated for so long suddenly felt less like peace and more like a punishment. What was he protecting, really? A collection of memories, an empty house filled with echoes. The land was his legacy, yes, but what is a legacy without a life to pass it on to? The choice was no longer simple. It was a battle being waged within him, as fierce and unpredictable as the storm itself. And you, who are watching this right now, have you ever felt that? The sudden, crushing weight of a stranger's fate landing squarely in your hands, demanding a choice you are not prepared to make? Or perhaps you've been on the other side, like this girl, feeling utterly alone, judged by everyone without them knowing the truth of your story, praying for just one person to see past the surface. It's a moment that defines us, isn't it? The moment we decide whether to close the door or to open it, knowing that either choice will change us forever. If you know that feeling, the weight of that kind of moment, let us know in a quiet comment below. You are not alone in that struggle. The rain continued its assault on the roof, a relentless drumming that seemed to count down the seconds of his indecision. Arthur looked from the girl back to his own hands. They were the hands of a farmer, calloused and strong, hands that knew how to mend a broken fence, how to coax life from stubborn soil, how to hold on tight to what was his. But they felt clumsy now, useless. What good was mending a fence when a human being was broken right in front of him? The soil under his fingernails was the same soil he and Eleanor had poured their youth into, the very ground. That held all his memories. He had fought banks, droughts, and blights to keep this land. It was everything he had left of her. And this girl, this stranger, she was a threat to all of it. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that her trouble would not stay contained within the walls of this barn. Trouble in a small town is like a flood. It starts as a trickle of gossip, a whisper in the general store, and before you know it, it has swept through every home, poisoning wells of trust and turning neighbors into strangers. To shelter this girl was to stand against that flood. It was to draw a line in the dirt and dare the world to cross it. He was old, and he was tired. The fight had gone out of him years ago. He looked at her shivering form, the way she flinched when a particularly loud clap of thunder shook the barn, and he saw not a threat, but a reflection. She was as isolated by her fear as he was by his grief. Two people, trapped in two different kinds of storms, suddenly finding themselves in the same small, fragile shelter. He made a decision. It was not a grand, heroic one. It was small, hesitant, and born more of a weary empathy than of courage. He turned without a word and walked to a small tack room at the side of the barn. He returned a moment later with a thick wool horse blanket. It was old and smelled of hay and leather, but it was warm and dry. He didn't approach her directly, still wary of her fear. Instead, he gently laid the blanket over the edge of the hay pile within her reach. He backed away slowly, giving her space, his movements communicating a message he could not yet put into words. I am not a threat. He picked up his lantern, its light a steady, reassuring presence in the gloom. He turned to leave, to give her the illusion of being alone, to let her feel safe for a few precious hours. But as he reached the massive sliding door of the barn, he stopped and looked back. She hadn't moved, but her eyes were no longer on him. They were on the blanket. He had no idea who she was or what horrors she had fled. He had no idea that this small act of kindness was not an ending, but a beginning. He did not know that by opening his barn door to a frightened girl, he had just invited in a war that would demand more than his land, more than his safety. It would demand the very soul he had spent the last 20 years trying so hard to lock away. The storm outside was just wind and water. The storm he had just let inside was made of something far more dangerous, a fight for justice. The sun rose the next morning on a world washed clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of pale, fragile blue, and a land that glistened, every blade of grass, every leaf on every tree jeweled with water. But inside Arthur Blackwood's house, the storm had merely moved indoors. The air was thick with a tension that the fresh, rain-scrubbed breeze pushing through an open window could not dissipate. He had brought the girl Ilara from the barn into the warmth of the kitchen, a room that had not held a guest in nearly 20 years. She sat at the small wooden table, wrapped in one of Eleanor's old quilts, a steaming mug of coffee untouched between her small, trembling hands. She was a ghost at his table, a spectre of a life he had long since abandoned, and her silence was somehow heavier, more profound than the silence he had grown accustomed to. Arthur moved around the kitchen with the stiff, deliberate motions of an old man, his body a chronicle of aches and pains. He made breakfast, bacon and eggs, the smell filling the quiet house with a memory of other mornings, happier mornings. He placed a plate in front of her, a gesture that felt both monumental and clumsy. She flinched when he set it down, a small involuntary movement that spoke volumes of the world she had come from. He saw it, and a deep, weary ache settled in his bones. This was not his world anymore. His world was one of predictable chores, of the sun's slow journey across the sky, of conversations held only with himself and the ghosts of his memory. This girl, with her bottomless fear and the dark bruises blooming on her skin, was a complication his weary heart felt ill-equipped to handle. Every instinct for self-preservation, honed over 2 decades of solitude, screamed at him to take her to the sheriff, to make her someone else's problem. But he couldn't, because this kitchen, this house, this very land was built not on self-preservation, but on a promise. He looked out the window at the fields, dark and fertile under the morning sun, and he didn't see acres of dirt and crops. He saw Eleanor. He saw her 20-year-old self, her hands on her hips and a smudge of dirt on her nose, laughing as they hammered the first post for the fence line. He saw her standing on the porch, her belly swollen with a dream that would never be realized, her eyes full of a future they were supposed to build together. They had poured their youth into this soil, their sweat and their laughter and their tears. Their plan was simple, the kind of humble ambition that feels as solid as the earth itself, to fill this house with children, to watch them grow, to leave them something that would last, something that mattered. Then the sickness came, a quiet thief in the night. It took Eleanor quickly, mercilessly, leaving Arthur in a world that had lost its color, its sound, its very meaning. The house, once filled with her warmth and the scent of baking bread, became a hollow echo chamber. The silence she left behind was not peaceful. It was a living thing, a constant oppressive weight that reminded him of everything he had lost. He became the curator of a museum dedicated to a single memory. Her reading glasses still sat on the nightstand beside her side of the bed. Her favorite shawl was still draped over the back of the rocking chair by the fireplace. He had stopped time in this house, hoping that by preserving her things, he could somehow preserve a piece of her soul, a piece of himself. To let the world in, to let this girl and her troubles in, felt like a betrayal of that long, silent vigil. His trip into town later that morning felt different. Usually it was a simple mechanical task, a brief foray into a world he no longer felt a part of. But today, with the secret of the girl locked away in his house, the town of Harmony Creek seemed to watch him with 100 unseen eyes. Harmony Creek was a town built on a fragile veneer of civility, a place where everyone knew your name, your business, and your grandfather's biggest mistake. It was a town held in the palm of one family, the Crofts. They owned the grain mill that loomed over the town like a feudal castle. They owned the bank that held the deeds to nearly every farm. And they owned the loyalty of men who valued a steady paycheck over a clear conscience. To be on the right side of the Crofts was to have a measure of peace. To cross them was to invite a slow, quiet ruin. Arthur walked into Miller's general store, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place with the knot in his stomach. Martha Miller, the proprietor's wife, a woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing, watched him from behind the counter. He bought his usual supplies, flour, salt, coffee, but then he hesitated. He added a loaf of bread, a block of cheese, and a jar of apple butter, to his basket, things he hadn't bought in years. He could feel Martha's gaze on him, a silent calculation taking place behind her spectacles. "Expecting company, Arthur?" she asked, her voice laced with a casual curiosity that was anything but. The question hung in the air, a baited hook. "Just stocking up," he mumbled, his voice rough from disuse. He paid in cash, avoiding her eyes, feeling like a criminal for the simple act of buying food. The whispers had not yet begun, but he could feel the seeds of them being planted in the fertile ground of small-town suspicion. Driving back to the farm, the weight of his decision pressed down on him. The land he was driving through was more than just his property. It was his sanctuary, his fortress against the grief that had threatened to drown him. He had fought for this land. When the bank, Croft's Bank, had tried to foreclose after Eleanor died and he'd fallen behind, he had worked himself to the bone, selling off his best cattle, taking on debts he knew he might never repay, just to hold on to this piece of the earth that held the last echoes of his wife. This farm was his legacy, the only thing he had left to prove that his life, that their life, had meant something. And now he was risking it all for a stranger, for a girl with haunted eyes who had stumbled out of the storm and into the quiet ruin of his life. Was he a fool? Was he trading the last thing he had in the world for a trouble that would surely consume him? When he returned, he found Elara exactly where he had left her. The quilt still pulled tight around her shoulders, but she had eaten some of the breakfast. It was a small sign, a flicker of life in the face of so much fear. He sat down opposite her, pushing the bag of groceries gently across the table. He didn't ask questions. He knew that forcing her to speak would only drive her further into her shell. Instead, he started talking, his voice low and steady. He told her about the farm, about the stubbornness of the soil in the north pasture, about a cow that was due to calf any day now. He talked about the weather, about the way the light hit the hills in the late afternoon. He spoke of simple things, solid things, trying to build a bridge of normalcy across the chasm of her terror. And slowly, painstakingly, it began to work. Her voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper, a thread of sound in the quiet kitchen. "He won't stop looking for me." It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, a truth she knew in her bones. Arthur felt a cold dread seep into him. "Who?" he asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Every road in this county, every shadow, eventually led back to one place. She looked at him, her eyes finally meeting his, and in their depths he saw a terror so specific, so personal, it made his blood run cold. "Silas," she whispered, and the name dropped into the silence of the room like a stone into a deep well. Silas Croft, the heir to the Croft empire, a young man known for his charming smile, his expensive car, and a cruelty that was spoken of only in hushed tones, behind closed doors. Arthur felt the floor drop out from under him. This was not some passing trouble, some drunken mistake she was running from. This was the son of the most powerful man in the county. Silas Croft moved through the world as if it were his personal playground, protected by a wall of money and influence that made him untouchable. The stories were whispers, but they were there. Of farmhands who had crossed him and found themselves out of work and out of town, of girls who had caught his eye and later left Harmony Creek with their families, their departures sudden and unexplained. The town looked the other way, content to trade its conscience for the prosperity the Crofts provided. To stand against Silas was not just to stand against one man. It was to stand against the entire structure of their world. Now he understood the depth of her fear. It wasn't just the fear of a man. It was the fear of a system that would protect him, that would grind her into dust and pretend she never existed. And by hiding her, Arthur had just stepped into the path of that same machine. He was no longer just a reclusive old farmer. He was an obstacle. He was a loose thread in the carefully woven fabric of Croft dominance. The quiet life he had so painstakingly built for himself was over. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the questions from Martha Miller were just the beginning. Soon there would be other questions, less friendly ones. There would be cars driving slowly past his property, their occupants watching his house. There would be phone calls, with no one on the other end. The siege had begun. He looked at Elara, at her pale, determined face. He saw the flicker of fight that had somehow survived in her eyes, and in that moment he saw a faint echo of Eleanor. His wife had been a fighter, a woman who stood her ground against droughts and bankers, and the condescending smiles of men who thought a woman had no place running a farm. She never backed down from a fight she believed in. For 20 years, Arthur had backed down. He had retreated from life, from connection, from any fight that wasn't for the survival of his own solitude. He had let his grief win, but looking at this girl, he felt a stirring of something he thought had died with his wife, a sense of righteous anger, a feeling that some things are wrong, and they must be fought no matter the cost. And what about you watching this story unfold? Have you ever been faced with a choice where doing the right thing meant risking everything you had worked your entire life to build? A moment where your comfort and your safety were on one side of the scale, and the fate of another human being was on the other. It is easy to be brave in theory, but what happens when the threat is real, when it is standing at your door? It is in those moments that we discover who we truly are. If you have ever felt the weight of a choice like that, a choice that could undo your whole world, share a thought in the comments. There is strength in knowing you are not the only one to have walked that difficult road. The afternoon light slanted through the kitchen window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The house was still quiet, but the nature of the silence had changed. It was no longer the empty silence of grief. It was the tense, waiting silence before a battle. Arthur stood up and walked to the window, his gaze sweeping over the fields that were his life's work, his sanctuary, his prison. He had invited the world back in, and he knew it was a world that would show him no mercy. He had spent 2 decades running from the pain of the past, hiding in the shell of this farm, but he was beginning to realize that you cannot protect a memory by locking it away. You protect it by honoring what it stood for. He had made a choice in the barn last night, a small, hesitant choice born of a flicker of empathy. Now in the clear light of day, he was making another one. This choice was harder, heavier, and it was made with his eyes wide open to the consequences. He would not turn her out. He would not sacrifice this girl to the wolves to save himself. He didn't know how he would fight them, what weapons an old man with a failing farm could possibly have against the power and wealth of the Croft family. But he knew he had to try. He had chosen to shelter a stranger from the storm, but he understood now with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating that the real storm hadn't passed at all. It had simply found a new place to gather its strength, right on the edge of his land, and it was coming for them both. The days that followed were not a return to quiet, but the beginning of a slow, creeping siege. The fragile peace Arthur had brokered with a warm meal and a shared silence was the first casualty. The war did not arrive with the sound of cannons, but with the crunch of gravel on the long dirt road leading to his farm. It was a black car, sleek and out of place against the rustic landscape, the kind of car that belonged to the Crofts. It drove past once, slowly, a deliberate and menacing crawl. It didn't stop. It didn't have to. The message was as clear as a noose left on his doorstep. We know. We are watching. Arthur saw it from the barn, his hand freezing on the handle of a pitchfork. A coldness, entirely different from the chill of his lonely years, settled deep in his marrow. It was the coldness of being seen, of being marked. Beside him, Ilara, who had been helping him scatter feed for the chickens, had shrunk into herself, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She had seen the car too, and for her it was not a message. It was the ghost of her past come to claim her. The siege quickly spread from his borders into the heart of the town. His next trip to Miller's General Store was a study in social frost. The usual nods from familiar faces were absent. Eyes that once met his with a look of neighborly respect now slid away, finding sudden interest in a sack of flour or a shelf of canned peaches. Martha Miller, who had once shared town gossip with him over the counter, was now brisk and businesslike, her lips a thin, disapproving line. She counted his change into his hand, without their fingers ever touching, as if his very presence were a contagion. He was no longer Arthur Blackwood, the quiet widower who kept to himself. He was now the old fool on the edge of town, the one hiding that troubled girl, the one who had brought the unwanted attention of the Crofts down upon them all. He could feel their judgment, a palpable force, thick and suffocating like the humid air before a storm. Have you ever felt that? The moment a community, your community, decides you are no longer one of them. It is a unique kind of exile, a loneliness that is somehow far worse than being physically alone. The Crofts, however, did not deal only in whispers and cold shoulders. Their power was rooted in something far more tangible, the economic lifeblood of the county. A few days later, the weekly delivery of feed and supplies he depended on never arrived. When he called the supplier in the next town, the owner, a man he'd done business with for 30 years, was full of flimsy excuses, a broken axle, a mix-up in the schedule. But Arthur heard the real reason in the man's strained voice: fear. The Crofts had made their calls. Arthur Blackwood was to be cut off, starved out. His credit at the general store, a courtesy extended to him for decades, was suddenly and inexplicably revoked. "Cash only from now on, Arthur," Martha Miller told him, her eyes refusing to meet his. He stood there, his worn wallet in his hand, feeling the humiliation of it like a physical blow. They were not just attacking him, they were attacking the farm. They were attacking Eleanor's legacy, strangling the life from the very land he had sworn to protect. It was a slow, methodical dismantling of his world, piece by painful piece. The weight of it all began to press down on Ilara. She watched from the kitchen window as Arthur struggled to fix a piece of old machinery by himself, his movements slower, his shoulders more slumped than they had been just a week before. She saw the worry etched into the lines around his eyes when he counted out the few dollars he had left on the kitchen table. She was the cause. Her storm had become his, and it was tearing his world apart. One evening, as he came in from the fields, covered in grease and dirt, his face a mask of exhaustion, she stood before him, her hands twisted in the fabric of her borrowed dress. "I should go," she said, her voice barely audible. I can't let them do this to you because of me." Her guilt was a raw, open wound. Arthur looked at her, this girl who was trying to sacrifice herself to save him, and he felt a surge of anger, not at her, but at the world that had made her believe she was worth so little. "This is my home," he said, his voice rough but firm. "No one is leaving." But even as he said the words, a sliver of doubt entered his heart. Was he being noble, or was he just being a stubborn old fool, dragging them both down into a fight he had no chance of winning? The answer came that night. The sound of shattering glass ripped through the quiet of the farmhouse, a violent explosive crack that sent a jolt of adrenaline through Arthur's sleeping body. He was out of bed in an instant, his heart pounding against his ribs, grabbing the old shotgun he kept by his door. He found Ilara huddled in the corner of the living room, her face as white as a sheet, staring at the front window. A large rock lay on the floor amidst a spray of broken glass. The cold night air poured into the room, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and pure menace. Tied around the rock was a piece of dirty twine, and attached to it a folded piece of paper. His hands trembled as he untied it. The words were scrawled in a crude, angry script, a message meant to terrorize. Give her back. It was a violation, a desecration. This house was his sanctuary, the last sacred place where Eleanor's memory was safe, and they had broken it. They had reached inside his fortress and reminded him that its walls were just wood and glass, and that they could tear them down whenever they pleased. The days that followed were a descent into a quiet hell. Arthur boarded up the broken window, the raw pine a scar on the face of his home. He began sleeping in the chair by the door, the shotgun resting across his lap, his sleep a shallow, fitful thing, punctuated by the imagined sound of approaching cars or footsteps in the dark. The fear was a constant companion now, a bitter taste in the back of his throat. He looked at his dwindling supplies, at the fields that needed tending, at the ever-present threat lurking just beyond his fence line, and a deep, weary despair began to take root in his soul. He was old, he was tired. The fight he had felt stirring within him was being ground down by the relentless, daily pressure. What was he even fighting for? The memory of a dead wife, the life of a girl who was a complete stranger? He would lose the farm. He would lose everything he had spent his life building and protecting. For the first time in 20 years, the thought of giving up, of simply letting the world win, felt less like a failure and more like a release. Just as the despair threatened to consume him entirely, a small, unexpected act of defiance rekindled a dying ember of his resolve. He found Ilara in the barn one afternoon, not hiding, but working. She had found Eleanor's old sewing kit and was meticulously mending a tear in one of his work shirts, her fingers, though still trembling slightly, moving with a focused determination. The sight stopped him, in his tracks. It was such a small domestic act, yet it was an act of creation in the midst of so much destruction. It was an act of faith, a quiet declaration that they were still a home, not just a hideout. She looked up and saw him watching, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. It was torn, she said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. In that moment, she wasn't just a symbol of his troubles. She was a person, a girl trying to stitch a life back together. He remembered Eleanor doing the same thing, sitting in the evening light by the fire, her brow furrowed in concentration as she mended his clothes. The memory didn't bring pain this time. It brought a flicker of strength. He was not just protecting a stranger. He was protecting the very idea of what this home was meant to be. But the world outside was relentless. The next blow came from a man he had known his entire life, Jedediah, his neighbor to the west, a man whose father had farmed alongside Arthur's. Father appeared at his fence line one afternoon. He didn't come to the house but hailed Arthur from a distance, a clear sign that he was not paying a social call. Jed's face was etched with worry and something that looked like pity. "Arthur," he began, his voice low, "people are talking. Croft is putting the squeeze on everyone. No one wants trouble." He paused, kicking at a clump of dirt with his boot. "Just think about what you're doing. She's not your blood. Is she worth all this? Is she worth this place?" The question hung in the air, a betrayal so profound it stole the breath from Arthur's lungs. This was not the threat of an enemy. This was the plea of a friend urging him to surrender. It was the voice of the town, the voice of reason, the voice of fear, and it told him in no uncertain terms that he was utterly and completely alone. What do you do when the silence of your friends is louder than the threats of your enemies? It's a moment that tests the very foundation of who you believe you are. The threats soon escalated from veiled to overt. Silas Croft's men grew bolder. They no longer just drove by. One morning, as Arthur tried to drive his old truck into town for the few supplies he could still afford, their black car blocked the road. Two large, grim-faced men got out and approached his window. They didn't touch him. They just leaned against his truck, their presence an immovable wall. The one with a scar that cut through his eyebrow smiled, a cruel, predatory expression. "Mr. Croft is a patient man," he said, his voice a low rumble, "but his patience is wearing thin. He always gets what he wants." He tapped a thick finger on Arthur's window, right at eye level. "You're an old man. You don't want your last days to be your hardest days. Think about that." They got back in their car and drove off, leaving Arthur sitting in his truck, his hands shaking so violently he couldn't grip the steering wheel. The air was thick with the smell of their cheap cologne and the stench of his own fear. They hadn't laid a hand on him, but he felt bruised all the same. The next attack was aimed directly at the heart of his life's work. He awoke one morning to a sight that made his stomach clench in horror. During the night, someone had come onto his land with wire cutters. A long section of his northern fence, the one bordering the pasture where he kept his few remaining cattle, had been cut to ribbons. The cattle, his last significant asset, the living remnants of the herd he and Eleanor had built, were gone. They had wandered off through the broken fence into the surrounding woods and hills. It was a devastating blow, both practical and symbolic. The fences were more than just wire and posts. They were the lines he had drawn around his life, the boundaries that kept his world intact. And now they lay broken and useless. He spent the entire day, from sunup to sundown, walking the hills, his old body screaming in protest. Searching for his animals, he found most of them, but the effort left him depleted, his bones aching with a fatigue so profound it felt like it had settled in his soul. That evening, he collapsed into the chair by the cold fireplace, every inch of his body a symphony of pain. He was physically exhausted, financially ruined, and emotionally shattered. The farm, his sanctuary, felt like a prison. The silence of the house was no longer a comfort. It was the sound of his defeat. He looked across the room at Ilara, who was watching him with wide, worried eyes. She was the epicenter of this earthquake that had leveled his life. For a fleeting, terrible moment, he hated her for it. He hated her for bringing this trouble, for forcing him into a fight he was losing, for making him feel this old, this weak, this helpless. The resolve he had clung to had crumbled into dust. Jedediah's words echoed in his mind. Is she worth this place? And for the first time, the answer that came back was a silent, soul-crushing no. He couldn't do it anymore. He had to make it stop. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the decision solidifying in his chest like a block of ice. He had to send her away. He would drive her to the next county, leave her at a bus station, give her the last of his money and tell her to run. It was a cruel choice, but it was the only one left. It was her or the farm, her or the last piece of Eleanor he had left in the world. He pushed himself up from the chair, his joints groaning in protest, and walked towards her. He saw the fear in her eyes as he approached, the fear of a hunted animal that knows the chase is over. He opened his mouth to speak the words that would seal her fate, the words that would save his farm but condemn his soul. "Elara," he began, his voice a dry, cracked whisper. We can't." But before he could finish, before he could utter the sentence that would break them both, a sound cut through the tense silence of the room. It was not the roar of an engine or the shattering of glass. It was a quiet, hesitant but insistent knock at the front door. A knock in the dead of night, where no visitor should be. A knock that could be anything. A final warning, a final assault, or something else entirely. The knock was a sound so alien to the house, so contrary to the rhythm of fear and silence that had taken root within its walls, that for a moment Arthur thought he had imagined it. It was not the violent crash of a rock or the threatening rumble of a car engine. It was a sound from another time, a civilized, almost timid sound. 3 quiet, deliberate raps on the wooden door. He froze, his mouth half open, the words of dismissal for Elara dying on his lips. Across the room, her eyes widened. The flicker of hope that had been there moments before her potential exile, now replaced by a stark, primal terror. To her, any knock in the night could only mean one thing. They had found her. The hunt was over. Arthur's hand went instinctively to the shotgun leaning against his chair. The feel of the cold steel was a familiar, if inadequate, comfort. He held up a hand to Elara, a silent command to stay put, to not make a sound, and moved toward the door with the slow, pained steps of an old man whose body was at war with his will. He peered through the small crack between the curtain and the window frame, his heart a heavy, erratic drum against his ribs. He expected to see the broad, menacing shoulders of Silas's thugs, their faces illuminated by a flashlight beam. But he saw nothing of the sort. Standing on his porch, silhouetted against the dark, rain-slicked night, was a single figure. An old man, stooped and frail, his hat dripping water onto the porch boards. He was holding a worn leather medical bag. It was Dr. Miller, the town physician, a man Arthur hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to in as many years. Confusion warred with suspicion in Arthur's mind. What was he doing here? At this hour? Was this some new insidious trick? A Trojan horse sent by the Crofts to gain entry? He pressed the barrel of the shotgun against the door, his thumb resting on the safety. He opened the door a bare inch, the chain holding it fast. "What do you want, Doc?" he asked, his voice a low growl. Dr. Miller didn't flinch. He just looked at Arthur with eyes that were ancient, with a weariness that mirrored his own. "I'm not here for them, Arthur," the doctor said, his voice quiet but clear over the sound of the dripping rain. "I heard the whispers. I came to see about the girl." The words hung in the air, a fragile offering of peace in the midst of a war. Arthur studied the old doctor's face, searching for any sign of deceit. He saw none. He saw only a deep, profound exhaustion and something else, something he recognized from his own reflection in the mirror on his darkest nights. Regret. With a sigh that seemed to drain the last of his fight from him, Arthur slid the chain free and opened the door. Dr. Miller stepped inside, bringing with him the smell of the damp night and something else, the faint, clean scent of antiseptic that clung to him like a second skin. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. The boarded-up window, the shotgun in Arthur's hand, the terrified girl huddled in the corner. He gave a slow, sad nod, as if confirming a diagnosis he had long feared. He set his bag down on the kitchen table and turned to Elara, his voice gentle. "Let me take a look at those bruises, child. I won't hurt you." Elara looked from the doctor to Arthur, her eyes asking a silent question. Arthur gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a leap of faith, a desperate bet on the decency of a man he barely knew, but it was the only move he had left to make. As the doctor worked cleaning and tending to the dark marks on Elara's skin with a practiced, gentle efficiency, a new kind of silence settled over the room. It was not the empty silence of grief or the tense silence of fear, but a quiet, waiting silence. The small, focused beam from the doctor's headlamp was a tiny island of light in the dimly lit room, a beacon of care in a world that had shown this girl nothing but brutality. Arthur watched, his shotgun now resting against the wall, feeling like a spectator in his own home. He watched the doctor's gnarled, steady hands apply a soothing salve, and he saw in that simple act a profound rebellion. It was an act of healing in a town that had chosen to be sick, an act of mending in a place where things were only ever broken. For the first time in days, Ilara's shoulders began to relax, the tight knot of terror in her posture loosening just a fraction under the doctor's calm, professional care. It was a small thing, a barely perceptible shift, but it felt as momentous as the turning of a season. When he was finished, Dr. Miller sat back, his face grim in the lamplight. He looked at Arthur, and the dam of his long-held silence finally broke. "This town is sick, Arthur," he began, his voice low and laced with a shame so deep it seemed to have settled in his bones. "It's a sickness of the soul. We all have it. We see what the Crofts do, what that boy Silas does, and we look away. We tell ourselves it's not our business. We tell ourselves we have families to feed, mortgages to pay at their bank." He looked down at his own hands, as if they were evidence of his complicity. "I've patched up farm hands who've fallen down the stairs at the mill. I've treated girls for nervous exhaustion after they spent an evening with Silas. I've signed papers and kept my mouth shut for 30 years because I was a coward." The confession filled the small room, raw and painful and utterly true. It was the voice of the town's conscience finally, belatedly, finding the courage to speak. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, and he delivered the blow that would change everything. "She's not the first one. Arthur." He looked over at Ilara, who had frozen, her eyes wide. "5 years ago there was another girl, Sarah Jenkins. Her family were sharecroppers on the north side of the county. She was bright, spirited, and she caught Silas's eye. She turned him down, just like this one did. A week later she disappeared." The doctor's voice cracked. "Her father came to me, begging for help. He said Silas had hurt her. I saw the bruises on her myself, a few days before she vanished. But I told him I couldn't get involved. I told him to take his family and leave before worse happened." He closed his eyes, the memory of fresh torment. They were gone by morning. The Crofts bought their contract, ploughed their fields under. It was like they never existed. And I did nothing. I let that girl be erased because I was afraid of losing this. He gestured around at the empty air, at his life, his practice, his quiet, compromised existence. Arthur listened, and with every word the doctor spoke, he felt a profound and terrible shift happening inside him. The weary despair that had been crushing him, the selfish calculation of his farm versus her life, it all burned away, replaced by a cold, hard, clarifying rage. This was not just about Silas and Ilara anymore. It was about Sarah Jenkins. It was about every person who had been ground under the heel of the Croft family. It was about a town that had sold its soul for a quiet life. He looked at the boarded-up window, and he no longer saw a scar on his home. He saw his own complicity, his own retreat from the world. He had boarded himself up just as securely, hiding from a grief he couldn't face, while outside his fences, a rot had been allowed to fester and grow. His fight to protect the farm, to protect Eleanor's memory, had been a selfish, backward-looking battle. He saw now, with a terrible and galvanizing clarity, that the only way to truly honor his wife's memory was to fight for the values she had embodied: justice, courage, and the simple, unwavering belief that you stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves. And what about you? What would you do in that moment, when you learn that the injustice you are witnessing is not a single, isolated act, but a pattern, a deep and festering wound on the soul of your community? It is one thing to help a single person in need, to perform one act of kindness against the dark, but what happens when you realize you are not just fighting a man, but a system built on fear and silence? A system your friends and neighbors quietly support? Would you have the courage to stand up, knowing you would stand alone? Would you risk everything, not just to save one life, but to reclaim the soul of a place you once called home? Arthur looked at Dr. Miller, and for the first time in 20 years he did not feel alone. He saw not a coward, but a man like him, who had reached the end of his compromises. They were two old men, their bodies failing, their best years behind them. But they had something the Crofts, with all their money and power, did not. They had the truth, and they had nothing left to lose. "There's a county sheriff," Dr. Miller said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "McAllister. He's new, an outsider, not on Croft's payroll. If we could get word to him, if we had proof—" He trailed off, the monumental task hanging in the air. But the seed of a plan, however fragile, had been planted. It was no longer about hiding and enduring. It was about fighting back. The fear was still there, a cold knot in Arthur's stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful, unbending resolve. He would not lose this farm, not by surrendering it to despair, and not by trading his soul to save the land. He would make his stand right here on this ground that held all his love and all his sorrow, and he would make it a testament to a life well lived. The doctor left just as the first pale, grey light of dawn began to bleed over the eastern hills. He left behind a small bag of medical supplies and something far more valuable, a sliver of hope. Arthur stood on the porch, watching the doctor's car disappear down the long dirt road. The air was clean after the storm, and the world felt new, washed clean of its old despair. He turned and went back inside. Ilara was standing by the kitchen table, her hand resting on the back of a chair. She looked at him, and for the first time, he did not see a terrified victim. He saw a survivor. He saw a fighter. The fear was still in her eyes, but it was now joined by a flicker of something else, something that looked like defiance. The decision had been made in the quiet, desperate hours of the night. The line had been drawn not around his property, but in the moral landscape of his own heart. The fight to save his farm was over. The fight for justice, for the memory of a forgotten girl and the future of the one standing before him, had just begun. He did not know what horrors the day would bring, but he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that what was coming would be the most decisive night of all their lives. The heavens chose that night to break their silence. The storm that had been a distant, brooding promise on the horizon for hours finally arrived, not as a gentle rain but as a biblical deluge, a furious assault of wind and water that seemed intent on scouring the very memory of the sun from the sky. Inside the small farmhouse, the lamplight flickered, casting long trembling shadows that danced like spectres on the walls. Every gust of wind that slammed against the house was a physical blow, every crack of thunder a reminder of the world's immense and indifferent power. For Arthur and Ilara, it was the sound of the enemy at the gates. They were not waiting for the storm to pass. They were waiting for the far more dangerous storm that wore a human face. The sound, when it came, was not subtle. It was the brutal, splintering crack of the front door, being kicked from its hinges, a violation that ripped through the home's fragile peace. Two figures, broad and dark against the violent canvas of the storm, filled the doorway, bringing the wind and rain in with them. And then a third figure stepped between them, wiping rain from his face with a casual, almost bored arrogance. It was Silas Croft. He was not dressed for the weather. His fine leather shoes were caked in mud, his tailored coat soaked through, but he wore his entitlement like a shield against the elements, his eyes scanning the simple room with a look of undisguised contempt. He saw Ilara, huddled behind the kitchen table, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his handsome face. "Well now," Silas said, his voice cutting easily through the howl of the wind. "Look what the old man dragged in. I believe you have something that belongs to me." His gaze shifted to Arthur, who stood between him and the girl, the old shotgun held tight in his trembling hands. Silas chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. "Put that toy away, old man. You're in no position to be making threats." He took a step into the room, his men fanning out behind him, their presence turning the small kitchen into a cage. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of wet wool and the unspoken promise of violence. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of old bones. He was outmatched, he knew it, but he did not lower the gun. Silas sighed, a theatrical display of feigned patience. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He let it dangle from his fingertips. The legal document, a stark white flag of surrender in the dim light. "I came to offer you a deal, Blackwood, a gesture of my family's generosity." He let the word hang in the air, a mockery of the concept. "This," he said, flicking the paper, "is the deed to your farm, the debt your wife left you with, the one you've been drowning under for 20 years. My father holds the note. Sign the girl over to me and I'll tear this up right here. The farm is yours, free and clear. You can live out your last miserable days on this worthless patch of dirt in peace." The offer was a masterpiece of cruelty, a choice designed to poison the very soul. He was offering Arthur everything he had fought for, everything he had sacrificed for, in exchange for the one thing he could not give. Arthur's eyes were fixed on the paper. In its crisp folds, he saw not just the land, but Eleanor. He saw her smile as they planted the first row of corn. He saw her hands, calloused and strong, mending the very fences Silas's men had cut. He saw the life they had built, the legacy he had sworn to protect, all of it offered to him in a single devil's bargain. The weight of his exhaustion, the decades of loneliness and struggle, pressed down on him with a crushing force. For a fleeting, terrible moment, he considered it. He could save the farm. He could save the last tangible piece of her. And you who are watching this, have you ever been brought to that point? A moment where everything you have ever wanted, everything you have ever worked for, is placed in one hand, and your conscience, your very soul, is placed in the other. It is a choice that comes in the dead of night, in the quietest, most desperate corners of our lives. It is the moment we learn what our love, our memories, and our principles are truly worth when the price is set impossibly high. It is the crucible that burns away everything but the truth of who we are. Arthur looked from the deed to Elara. He saw her face, pale with terror, her eyes pleading with him. But beneath the fear, he saw the same flicker of defiance that had kept her alive this long. He saw not just a stranger, not just a problem, but a life. He saw the ghost of Sarah Jenkins, the girl who had been erased, and he knew that to accept this deal was to become a part of that erasure. It was to become a man like Dr. Miller had been, a man who looked away. He had spent 20 years looking away, hiding from the world in his grief. He would not do it for one more second. He lowered the shotgun, not in surrender, but with a newfound steadiness. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it resonated with the weight of a final, irrevocable decision. "The land is just dirt, Mr. Croft," he said. "It's worthless without a soul to work it, and my soul is not for sale." Silas's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of pure reptilian fury. His charm was a thin veneer, and Arthur had just scratched it away to reveal the monster beneath. "Wrong answer, old man," he hissed. He nodded to his men. The world exploded into motion. One of the thugs lunged forward, swatting the shotgun from Arthur's hands with a contemptuous backhand. It clattered uselessly to the floor. The other grabbed Elara, her scream stifled as his massive hand clamped over her mouth. They dragged her, kicking and struggling, towards the door. Arthur, propelled by a desperate paternal rage, threw himself at them, but he was old and slow. A single brutal blow to his stomach sent him crashing to his knees, the air driven from his lungs in a painful gasp. "You had your chance," Silas sneered, standing over him. "Now you'll lose it all." He gestured with his head towards the door. "Take them to the barn, both of them. We're going to have a little bonfire, a nice, warm end to a cold, wet night." The men dragged Arthur and Elara out into the raging storm, their feet slipping in the thick mud. The wind tore at their clothes, the rain a sheet of icy needles against their skin. They were shoved into the cavernous darkness of the barn, the place where this story had begun. The massive doors slid shut behind them with a deafening boom, plunging them into a near-total blackness, the only light coming from the thin cracks in the walls, illuminated by the flashes of lightning outside. The air in the barn was thick with the familiar, comforting smells of hay and earth, but now it was tainted by something else, a sharp, acrid scent that made Arthur's stomach clench. Gasoline. He could hear Silas's men splashing it from a can, the liquid soaking into the dry hay, the very hay that had once been Elara's hiding place. They were trapped. This was the end. He stumbled through the dark until he found Elara, huddled against a hay bale, her body racked with silent sobs. He knelt beside her, his old bones protesting, and put a clumsy, comforting arm around her shoulders. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with a grief that had nothing to do with the loss of his farm. "I'm so sorry I brought you into this." She looked up at him, her face a pale oval in the gloom, and shook her head. "You didn't," she choked out. "You're the only one who didn't look away." Outside, Silas laughed, the sound carrying faintly through the walls. "Light it up," he yelled. A moment later, a flickering orange light appeared at the crack beneath the door. It grew brighter, hungrier. The smell of smoke began to fill the barn, a harbinger of the inferno to come. This was it, the final moments. Arthur held the girl tighter, shielding her with his own body, a final, futile act of protection. He closed his eyes and he did not see the flames. He saw Eleanor standing on the porch in the summer sun, her hand raised in a wave. He had failed her. He had lost the farm. He had lost everything. But in this last, terrible moment, he knew he had not lost himself. He had made his stand. It was a small, forgotten act of defiance in a world full of cowards, but it was his. And then, through the roar of the storm and the growing crackle of the flames, another sound cut through the night, a sound that did not belong, a siren. At first it was faint, a distant wail, but it grew rapidly closer, a piercing shriek of authority that sliced through the chaos. The orange glow at the door vanished. There was a moment of confused shouting from outside, the sound of running feet. Suddenly the barn doors were wrenched open, and the world outside was no longer dark, but filled with a strobing, disorienting kaleidoscope of red and blue light. Standing there, flanked by two uniformed deputies, was a tall man in a sheriff's coat, his face set and grim, and just behind him, his face illuminated by the flashing lights, was Dr. Miller, his expression a mixture of terror and profound relief. The scene that unfolded was one of swift, decisive justice. Silas's thugs, their bravado evaporating in the face of the law, dropped their lighters and raised their hands without a fight. Silas, however, was a cornered animal. His face, caught in the flashing lights, was a twisted mask of disbelief and rage. "You have no right," he screamed at the sheriff. "Do you know who I am?" The sheriff, a man whose face showed he was unimpressed by such questions, simply stepped forward. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Croft." It was then that Ilara, finding a strength she never knew she possessed, stepped out of the shadows of the barn and into the light. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer a whisper. It was clear, steady, and filled with the unshakable power of the truth. "He tried to kill us," she said, pointing a trembling but determined finger at Silas. Silas scoffed, a desperate last-ditch effort to reclaim control. The word of a troubled girl against mine? Who are they going to believe? But his confidence was a fragile, hollow thing. Dr. Miller stepped forward, his own voice finding its courage. "They'll believe me, Silas, I'll testify. About tonight, and about Sarah Jenkins. I'm done being silent." The name hit Silas like a physical blow. His face went slack, the color draining from it. And then Ilara delivered the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. She reached into the pocket of the dress Arthur had given her and pulled out a small, metallic object. It glinted in the flashing lights. It was a silver cufflink, ornate and expensive, with the initial C elegantly engraved upon it. "This fell off his shirt," she said, her voice ringing with clarity. "The night I ran." It was over. The cufflink, the doctor's testimony, the gasoline cans, the attempted murder. It was a mountain of evidence that not even the Croft name could overcome. The arrogance drained out of Silas, replaced by a pathetic, sniveling fear. He was no longer the untouchable heir. He was just a criminal, his power an illusion that had just been shattered by the courage of an old man, a frightened girl, and a doctor who had finally found his conscience. The sheriff snapped the handcuffs onto Silas's wrists. The metallic click, a sound of finality, a sound of chains not being forged but broken. As they led him away, a pathetic, rain-soaked figure, Arthur stood beside Ilara, the rain washing the soot and the fear from their faces. He looked at his barn, the scorched wood at the base of the door, a testament to how close they had come to the end. He had almost lost everything, but as he looked at the girl standing beside him, he knew he had gained something far more valuable. The dawn that followed was quiet and clean. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that felt scrubbed new. News of Silas Croft's arrest spread through Harmony Creek like a cleansing fire. The whispers that had once condemned Arthur now turned to murmurs of awe and respect. When he went into town a few days later, the change was palpable. People who had averted their eyes now met his gaze with a look of shame and then of gratitude. Martha Miller, from behind her counter, pushed a bag of coffee towards him. "This is on the house, Arthur," she said, her voice soft. We're sorry." It was not a full apology, but it was a beginning. It was the first crack in the town's long-frozen conscience. His neighbor, Jedediah, appeared at his fence line that afternoon, not to warn him away, but with a hammer and a roll of new wire. They worked together in silence for an hour, mending the fence, and in that shared simple act, they mended something far more important. The weeks turned into months. The farm, which had been on the brink of death, slowly came back to life. With a small loan from a bank in the next county, a bank not owned by the Crofts, Arthur bought new cattle. He and Ilara worked side by side, their days filled with the steady, healing rhythm of chores. The silence of the house was gone, replaced by the sound of two people building a life together. It was not the life Arthur had planned with Eleanor, but it was a good life, a life of purpose. The house was no longer a museum of grief. It was a home, alive with the smell of baking bread and the promise of a future. Ilara, no longer haunted, began to smile. Her laughter, a sound Arthur had not heard in his house for 20 years, was the sweetest harvest the farm had ever produced. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, they sat together on the porch steps, just as he and Eleanor used to do. He finally told her all about his wife, not with the pain of loss, but with the warmth of loving memory. He spoke of her strength, her laughter, her unwavering belief in doing the right thing no matter the cost. She would have liked you, he said, and he knew it was the truest thing he had ever said. In saving Ilara, he had not betrayed Eleanor's memory. He had honored it in the most profound way possible. He had finally understood that legacy is not a plot of land or a collection of things you leave behind. It is the lives you touch, the courage you inspire, the love you give. He had lost a wife, but he had found a daughter. He had lost a past he could never reclaim, but he had found a future he never thought possible. How many times in our own lives do we find ourselves in a cage? Sometimes it is a cage of grief, like Arthur's, built to protect us from a world that has hurt us. Sometimes it is a cage of judgment, like the one the town built around Ilara, made of whispers and fear. We build these walls, or we allow others to build them for us, and we forget that the world outside is still waiting. But every now and then, a storm comes. A person, a choice, a moment of truth arrives that forces us to look past our own fences, to tear down our own walls. It is a terrifying moment, a moment that demands everything from us, but it is also a moment of grace. It is the moment that reminds us that the only way to truly save ourselves is to reach out and save someone else. It is the day that everything can change. If this story spoke to a truth in your own life, if you have ever faced a moment that felt like a final reckoning and came out the other side changed forever, let us know in the comments below. Simply write, "I also lived a turning point," because your story, like Arthur's, is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a reminder that even after the most violent storm, a new and beautiful dawn is always waiting to break.